All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA UK Mod Strategic Advantage speaker session entitled Adapting the Future Forces for Strategic Advantage, US and UK Senior Leaders in Conversation. I'd also like to thank today's distinguished guests, Air Marshal Ian Gale, the Director General of Joint Force Development at UK Stratcom, and Vice Admiral Stuart Munsch, the Director for Joint Force Development at the US Joint Staff J7, for taking the time to speak with us today. So before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's brief. So during the presentation or during the Q&A, please feel free to submit your question through ZoomGov's chat function. It's a chat icon at the bottom bar of your screen. Also, go ahead and submit all of your questions today to Mariah Yeager. Her questions should be listed, or her name should be listed as questions-Mariah Yeager. Questions that aren't submitted to Mariah specifically may not be addressed, so please make sure to send your questions to Mariah today. Also note that your name is going to appear in the chat before your question, and it'll be read out loud before we address that question. If you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, go ahead and rename yourself by going to participants at the bottom bar of your screen, then more next to your name, and finally rename. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's distinguished guests before turning the floor over to our representative from the UK Mod, Professor Richard Allington. So Vice Admiral Stuart Munsch is the Director for Joint Force Development within the US Joint Staff J7. He assumed this position in 2020 after a long, rich career in the US Navy, including serving as the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans, and Strategy for OPNAV N3 and 5, and establishing and serving as the initial Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Warfighting Development N7. We also have Air Marshal Ian Gale, who is the Director General for Joint Force Development for UK Stratcom. He was appointed to this position in April 2021 and is responsible for the conceptual element of UK fighting power, i.e. concepts and doctrine, training and education, exercise and experimentation, lessons learned, and innovation. And he has also had a long, rich career in the US Air Force, including serving as Assistant Chief of Air Staff. Both of our speakers' full biographies are available in the event invitation that was distributed by email. And without any further ado, I'm going to turn over the floor to Professor Richard Allington to provide some opening remarks. So Richard, over to you.
Thanks very much, Nicole. Hopefully you can at least hear me okay. So my name is Richard Allington, and I work for the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory, which is the S&T branch of the UK Ministry of Defence. And we're working with Todd and the FMA team on a joint MOD-DOD series focused on strategic advantage. Really excited to have this discussion today with two very senior leaders in this area. If I tell you briefly about how the topic originated, discussing it with Todd a few months ago, we looked at the sort of strategic publications which were coming out in the UK in terms of things like our integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy, our integrated operating concept, and the MOD S&T strategy. And the term strategic advantage kept coming up and over again. And we thought actually the best way to try and understand this and learn from the experience of people right at the top is to consider this through a number of different lenses. So we can think about our levers of power being diplomatic, industrial, military, and economic. And let's invite two most established leaders within the military area to have this discussion today and give us their view on what strategic advantage means for their areas. So we're thrilled to have Air Marshal Gale and Vice Admiral Munsch, both experts within joint force development, and really looking forward to the conversation. And I hope you have some very interesting questions on the things they're about to discuss. So without further ado, I'll leave it there and hand over to Todd, who's going to moderate the rest of the session. Todd.
Well, thank you so much, Richard. And thanks to all of their tuned in all over the world in all the different time zones that we reach out to. Again, thanking Richard and the team, his team there at DSTL in the UK for their wonderful collaboration, and particularly on this speaker series. As Richard suggested, these are very interesting times of rapid global systemic change, and to explore strategic advantage, given the foundational strategy documents that have emerged from both of our countries and will continue to come out, certainly as time comes and as the environment changes. We're blessed today to be able to have distinguished speakers, Air Marshal Gale and Vice Admiral Munsch, who are charged with the responsibility of looking out into the future to develop these concepts and to generate the force that is going to have to provide the strategic advantage that we're discussing for our respective nations and our allies and partners. So with that, I will turn it over for brief remarks before we go into a moderated Q&A. And I'll start with Air Marshal Gale, sir.
Thanks so much. Delighted to be here today. And of course, first advert will be that there won't be time to cover everything. So perhaps we'll get to it in questions. I thought I'd cover strategic advantage. What does that really mean to us? Our context from the UK and what our response has been. So strategic advantage, and my thanks to our friends in the net assessment team for some of this work, really, to me, is about matching against our national objectives. It has to have a target. We need to put it in context wherever we're using it. It's not that there is no such thing as universal advantage, which we need to take care of. And for there to be advantage, there has to be a competition. And the nature of that competition is important. Is it a competition or a strategic competition? If it's a competition, it might allow us to be precise and discriminate. If it's a strategic competition, then perhaps we're forced into competing everywhere. So for a country like us, we want to pick our competitions. We don't want to get into strategic competition. We want to make sure that we are able to pick and choose at a time of our desire. So if it's not versus broad policy, then that implies we must have measurables. We must understand the questions, the things we're competing for, and how we understand whether we've been successful. And that is really hard. Probably we'll come back to that. Things in our power, though, levers, which we directly control: information, military power, tech, that sort of thing, blended with a clear theory of winning, which I think to have, you need to understand your measures of effectiveness, back to that hard problem again. And then factors and conditions like alliances, soft power, geography, things like that, that you might be able to influence, but you probably can't control. So what does it mean for the UK? What's our context from our little island spot? Well, in the preamble to this conference, it talked about the economic centre of gravity moving east, and we completely agree with that. We see, and we've called the systemic challenge that China faces or poses to us. But of course, to us, China is also opportunity, not just challenge, not just potential adversary. So we've got to handle that quite carefully. But we also have a more pressing and immediate problem on our back door, and that's Russia. Russia probes us with in the underwater space, on the surface, and in the air routinely. As well as in space and cyber, which I think we probably share a little bit more often. But unlike you, we've had state-sponsored assassinations on our soil in recent years, and they've used radioactive matter and military-grade nerve agent in the form of Novichok. But both of these attacks risked mass casualties in addition to the murders that were perpetrated. That's a very significant escalation that we face almost uniquely. We have a public that's been focused on Brexit, really, rather than safety and security. Safety and security, which I might offer, is mostly taken for granted. And our adversary in our close abroad really understands where the seams lie. They operate with a mindset that crosses COCOMs and theatres. They operate in a campaigning mode. They are very good at escalating and de-escalating rapidly. And perhaps most dangerously for us, they're very opportunistic. So our assumption will have to be, in a more multipolar world than we faced before, that anything that might happen with a significant adversary in the Far East will trigger some activity in our near abroad. That would have to be our default assumption. So it's worrying and uncomfortable from this viewpoint, very closely and personally uncomfortable. So our response then has been the integrated operating concept. That's what came out of our integrated review. It establishes the notion, reminding us that we are in constant competition. It established that the armed forces should constantly be operating rather than an insurance policy, a break glass, a instrument of last resort. And it established that we should be better integrated. Now, there's an integration that you in the US will be very familiar with. It'll look a bit like JADC2. That's integrating across our domains, and particularly drawing space and cyber in to make them both part of our planning, but also understanding how conflict, competition, and potentially fighting will occur in those domains as well. But our integration across government and with our allies and partners is receiving a lot of attention now. We established the frameworks of protect, engage, constrain, and fight. We protect our homeland. We engage forward through persistent presence. We constrain our adversaries, and we warfight if we have to. And we talked about using tech and supercharging that, but only sort of, not really looking to invent the next big thing, because we don't really believe that technology wins a war. There are other things that are more powerful, and perhaps AUKUS is a good example of that. I would say that's the single most important change in that region for some considerable time, and probably means more than all the metal that we'll put in that part of the world over the next few years. Additionally, we're the framework nation of something called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which I imagine many of you haven't heard of. It's a group of 10, 8 of whom are in NATO, and it's an opt-in rather than a consensus organization like NATO, focused exclusively really in the sub-threshold space. So it allows NATO, and by definition EUCOM, to have some rapid options that are not under their command or control, but are linked to them, that can work quicker than the machinery of NATO can. And in the escalatory move between competition, crisis, and maybe conflict, that might be the deciding factor. We're pushing training and education. Obviously, we are teaching all of these things to our people. The IOPSI is a profound difference for us, where we're focusing on this operating and being an instrument of first resort, whilst warfighting is still an effect of last resort. We're integrating data and cyber and all of the new topics, but really we're asking ourselves what new possibilities these open up. What can we do now? How can we change our approach in ways that weren't possible before? So bottom line, and to end with, we want to avoid war. We want to deal with rational actors who also understand that the cost to us all would be too great to be worthwhile. And we want to make sure that we increase that cost to solidify that condition. That means that we have to improve our deterrence, and competition is a vital part of improving that deterrence. But at the same time, and quite a challenge for a nation like us, we have to be credible and ready for the warfight that might come. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Air Marshal Gale. Vice Admiral Munsch.
Well, good day to everybody, and thanks for including me in this event, and thanks, Ian, for leading off for us here. I'm going to speak from an institutional standpoint, so that'll be the perspective I take here. I'm going to give you a simple model that I use here, and then some current conditions that we're in, the underlying problems, and then what some solutions can be. So that's a framework of what my remarks will be here. So the simple model, think of a milk stool, 3 legs. And the way I look at it is we've got mass, technology, and proficiency in terms of building a strategic advantage or a systemic advantage against an adversary. So mass, what can we bring in terms of platforms, weapons, and people at the problem? Technology, I think, speaks for itself, and then proficiency, the ability to put it all together. And woven throughout that, of course, are allies and partners and the work that we do with them. Now, you can't rely on just one of the legs of the milk stool, otherwise it won't function. But you might have a leg that's stronger than others. And so, as we go forward here, part of our difficulty here is that there's at least one adversary that has a great deal of mass that they can generate, including what they have plus their manufacturing base. Technology, a lot of that are like cattle that have already left the barn in terms of what's been stolen via cyber theft. And so that leaves proficiency. And I think for those of us that are like-minded allies and partners, that's a real strong suit for us in terms of our longstanding experience in working together, and certainly most recently in these last 2 decades of fighting violent extremists. So what I'm going to focus on here a bit then is on that technology leg. Ian called out the other items, so to give you a little diversity, I'll drill down on that one. So some underlying conditions. First one is fairly obvious. Technology is changing faster all the time. Not dissimilar from Moore's law, and that's I think made even more profound in the military realm by the fact that for those of us that are like-minded nations, we leverage extensively the private industrial base, and so having any degree of control or even a deep knowledge of everything being developed is quite difficult. So the first one, technology changing faster all the time. The second one is that we are in an arms race. A lot of people don't want to admit that, but all it takes is one country to cause that condition to exist, and clearly that's happening with China right now. You look at what they've done over the past 2 decades, and most particularly just in the last several months with the nuclear breakout that they are executing. Quite clearly, they have initiated an arms race. The next point I would like to make the condition, and here I'm going to call upon for our British listeners, a famous philosopher in America, comes from the sport of baseball, the poor cousin of cricket, named Yogi Berra. And Yogi Berra said that in theory and practice are the same thing. In practice, they're different. And so my point here is that as we make decisions as an institution, there's a theoretical maximum to driving military advantage. And there's always a gap between what we do in practicality versus what would be in theory what we should do to maximize our military advantage. That has a lot to do with a bunch of bureaucratic factors, checks and balances in the system, ulterior motives, where you stand is where you sit, and that sort of thing. But the issue here is that we need to change that third factor, theory versus practice, to close those two. And the problem is it's actually widening right now. So what are the underlying problems that are driving that? I've hinted at a few of them there. First one is age old. It's what we need versus what is feasible. And at least in the U.S. Armed Forces, with as large as we are, that can be two different camps of people working in those areas. How we employ the force versus how we develop the force, and we call that the valley of death here in the U.S. How do we get things out of development and into the operating forces? Second underlying problem are a whole host of values versus security. And what's happened the last couple decades is that security was not a major concern when we were fighting violent extremists. And so we became very open in a whole lot of things as a result of other values being pushed more to their full throw. So, for example, in a threatening environment, you might not want to have universities completely open to students from any country. But we didn't have that condition, and so we have 300,000 Chinese students in the U.S., many of them working in labs where some of the best technology is being developed. If you have no threat, then the internet ought to be open to everybody. Everybody can be part of it. We've discovered that there's some serious drawbacks security-wise to that as well. Globalization. Nobody's a threat. Everybody ought to be part of that. Now we're finding out that maybe that isn't the best thing when you start to have some security concerns. So again, many different values, and most for very good reasons, got shifted to where they are. But there's a balance versus security that will need to be addressed. And of course, everybody has interest in this, and so that's a difficult move to make. The last problem I would give you is that we have many holdover behaviors from what we've done the last couple decades. being very open about what we do is only one of those. There are a lot of bureaucratic checks and balances in the U.S. system, which again are there for good reason. Uh, but that was again in an environment where security wasn't all that significant a problem. So let me get to some solutions here. The first one I would offer that would start helping to align people is to coalesce around a threat and the timeline that we expect that threat will emerge in a significant state. And I think here, Admiral Davidson, who is our previous Indo-PACOM commander, did quite a bit of good in his public testimony in identifying that the threat with China could be in 6 years. And that will start to coalesce efforts, at least here on the US side. The second thing is that, again, over the last couple of decades, without a threat to focus us, and with the way bureaucracies work, a lot of power in deciding what we were going to acquire for capabilities devolved down to the services. A lot of that was by design and the way we're set up with checks and balances. But completely absent was the process of establishing joint requirements, which then would fill in gaps that the services were not filling. Here again, we have good news. And our vice chairman has been very proactively changing our requirements process to leverage existing legislation to establish joint requirements that need to be done when there's emerging technology or new operating concepts. A third one is that because we do so much in series, we're too slow, and we need to start doing things in parallel. And an example of that would be we can make progress very quickly if we can bring together the technologists and the engineers, along with the operators, along with the budgeteers, and just do things together. You see that way down on the micro scale, like on a platform, where you've got the enlisted operator, you've got the engineer, and then you've got the program office that has the purse strings, and all three of them are standing around the piece of equipment that they're trying to advance. They can move very quickly there. Up on a macro scale, if we could bring together again the technologists and engineers within the military establishment, the operators, and then those representing our legislators who hold the purse strings. And then you can make much faster progress. And again, good news to deliver here. We did this last week. We did our largest war game of the year, run by J7, and we had all three of those elements together in order to develop a shared understanding and a tighter vision going forward. Now, those three solutions, having a threat timeline, top-down requirements, and having all the key players working together in a tight loop, presuppose something else, and that's that we know how we're going to fight in the future. And that also has been an element that has been missing for some time because we've not had a peer threat to be focused on that provided that focusing value. And the last time that we did have that, that was pre-Goldwater Nichols for us here on the U.S. side. And so we didn't have the joint environment like we do now. So concepts and of how we fight were developed just by services back then. So here again, we have good news, and we have a joint warfighting concept. And in the case of the U.S. side, we have chosen to leave that classified. And so I'll just have to leave that as a cliffhanger for you as to what it is, and we can move on to other topics. But thanks for the opportunity here to open up with my remarks.
Well, thank you both for those remarks. Lots to unpack there, and I think Air Marshal Gale, you said, hey, we'll hopefully cover some of this in Q&A because there certainly isn't time to hit it all opening. I wanted to ask, in your roles, which are I think essentially identical in your respective nations, it seems that you have to be one part historian, one part futurist. And I was wondering if you had found that to be the case, and if not, or if so, what other disciplines or what other sort of things help you navigate all that is in your job jar, if you will, in your area of responsibilities?
Todd, do you want to drive us and tell us who you want to start?
You can start, sir.
Okay. Well, so I really agree. I think a history and futurologist, gosh, the other one I put in there is losing prize fighting boxer. And by that, I mean, it'll be interesting to hear Stuart's take on this, but I think we quite often, or I certainly find myself being the bearer of bad news, and people, governments, organizations don't like to hear bad news. And so the instant response to it is to attack the bearer of the bad news. And I think that comes with the territory. And I think it's really important because sometimes, because of where we sit, we will be a singular voice that's swimming against the tide.
Excellent. Admiral Munsch, any thoughts on the historian
Yeah,
futurist?
Todd. Yeah, I agree. Those two are critical. In fact, a lot of this fight that we're anticipating here in the future has strong echoes from World War II. Obviously, the geography in many ways is the same, and that drives a lot of the problem set. But definitely a knowledge of all the institutional things that we did in the lead up to that war, the strategic decisions that we laid down, and then of course the fight itself, all very very informative. Um, Futurist, definitely. As you correctly diagnosed here, at least in J7, we cover we probably go deeper in history than almost anybody except maybe the staff historian here, and we look further into the future probably than anybody else. I'd add a couple of others though that go with that. Um, One is you have to be a technologist as well. Maybe you would wrap that up in futurist, but being able to understand some of what I think Ian was getting at as to what's feasible, what's realistic, and then being able to envision how you would bring that in. Another one I would add is you have to be a pretty good bureaucrat. At least here in this building where I work with nearly 26,000 people, probably as many opinions. You really got to know your way around here as to who provides the checks and balances and who you need to convince of things. So I think that's important too. Perhaps twinned with that would be you also need to be a communicator. I don't have a lot of direct authorities here in what I do, and so I rely mostly on influence. And so my ability to craft a vision, communicate it, work the bureaucracy behind the scenes, is I think the mix of how those things come together.
Thank you both. Thinking of imperfect foresight and no crystal ball, but the need to sometimes make big bets. We have and thinking of history, this was the case. The German Panzer forces were developed well before 1940 when they were employed, and of course in 1940 the Royal Air Force's Fighter Command was the world's first integrated air defense, and handed the Germans their first major loss in what was a very long great power war. So I wonder if and then that Air Force was also an investment, a big bet that was made well before it was actually called into service. So I wonder, and this is kind of obviously a technology dimension here, but what do you think the big bets are, and are we making them, or in the absence of perfect foresight? And Admiral Munsch, why don't you go ahead and start that, please?
Well, just a couple of big bets from World War II here. So Admiral Leahy was in many ways our chief strategist, and he saw that in the lead up to the war that we were going to be stretched pretty thin on manpower between two theaters. and given the population size of the adversaries. And so one of his early points is, what do we do with that manpower? Do we pour it into massive armies, or do we do something else with it? And he drove the choice that we put it into the workforce here and twin it with the advantage of the industrial base that the United States had, and then become the proverbial arsenal of democracy. And then you had to have something offsetting from that if you weren't going to have exceptionally large armies. And so the second half of that big bet was to put it into air power, and then for out in the Pacific into sea power as well. So that those a couple of big bets on the U.S. side. On the Japanese side, um, they had to make a big bet on where the fight would happen with the Americans. Would it be on the west coast of the U.S.? Would it be in the mid-Pacific? Would it be over toward the Japanese side? They made a big bet that it would be in the mid-Pacific. And one ramification of that then is what they did with air power. So if the fight's in the mid-Pacific, then it had to be carrier-based air power as opposed to shore-based air power. And so they also made a big bet that it would be a short, sharp war. And that drove how they developed their corps of pilots. So they decided on a relatively small corps, but very highly trained, with the idea in a short war that they would be very dominant and wouldn't need to persist for a lengthy amount of time. Well, as it turned out, both those bets were wrong. And so once we blew through the carrier force, and once we had attrited that initial cadre of pilots, then it was pretty, well, I shouldn't say quickly downhill, but it was, in hindsight, definitely downhill for them thereafter. So big bets for us. I think the new and frankly scary thing is cyber. Um, prior to cyber, we could have a sense of a scale of threat because it was in many ways in a physical form. You could monitor how many platforms the adversary had. You could monitor how much money they were putting into their armed forces. You could monitor how many people were involved. And all that had something of a direct correlation to how much military power they could generate. The scary thing about cyber is that that scale is absent now. One person who's quite good can do a huge amount of damage. And it's very difficult to even know who that person is. And it can happen near instantaneous as well, at least in terms of us understanding that there's a threat, because it can go undetected for so long. So I think that's one of the huge bets going forward, and how we deal with that.
Thank you. Air Marshal Gale.
Yes, so let me stick with the Battle of Britain because you brought it up, Todd. The Spitfire wasn't a world-beating aeroplane. It was better in some parts of the envelope than the 109, worse in others. Radar was invented by the Germans. The telephone had been invented elsewhere, but it was all off the leading edge of tech. But the clever bit was combining that sort of first, second follower technology in a way that nobody else had thought of. And even when we were doing it to the Germans in front of their faces, they didn't realize. So I think how we're trying to mobilize that in our people at the moment is getting our entire force thinking, I would say this, wouldn't I? Thinking about concepts and doctrine, thinking actively about how they will engage with this future fight, rather than it sitting in a department of the MOD. So I think that's really important. In terms of big bets that we're tracking, we're doing a lot of prep for the indicators of, and then how we maximize the promises of quantum when it comes. Because if you take it to the extreme, then a lot of things change very, very quickly. But on the way to that, of course, the quantum capability is increasing in a relatively understandable way. So seeing each of those little keys unlock locks is very important to us.
Thank you both. Air Marshal Gale, I wanted to follow up on something that you kind of mentioned there, and that is this notion of sort of mobilizing everyone to kind of think about the future. It's been my experience that we seem to be very reactive in our strategies. We seem to be very threat-based, and we develop strategies, policies to counter threats. But in your two roles, it seems to me that you are trying to move us to the front foot, to put the adversary on the horns of a dilemma, to make them react to our innovation, our new ideas, our even if taken from other places, as you suggest in the Battle of Britain example, where we integrate it better and put, again, them on the horns of a dilemma. How do you think we're doing on this? Do you feel like we're too reactive right now, or are we in need of becoming more proactive, and how might we do that?
Yeah, it's a great one, Todd. So I think there's a school of thought that says we've been distracted for 20 years with our conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, and our opponents and adversaries have watched us very carefully and used that time more strategically than we have. Now, there's another school of thought that says, right, we see the way that our adversaries are able to understand, control, decide quicker than we can. Let's try and do some of that. Well, for me, that is problematic because that's catch up, that's not offset. So where does our offset really lie? And it strikes me that our offset lies in allies and partners. That's unique. So that's really, really important. And, you know, if I may, that's an interesting one for a country like the US. The US is used to simply, bottom line, being able to do most things on its own, and through expediency or through the need to have political strength may invite allies and partners, but bottom line hasn't actually needed them to achieve its aims, arguably, in recent times. This is different, and not all allies and partners find it easy to integrate. So there's an important bit of work there that needs doing on both sides of that equation. The other thing we've got is we can genuinely harness all of our people, and we can offer multiple dilemmas as a result of our allies and partnerships. And that, again, in terms of deterrence, can just raise the cost to the point that we can avoid the thing that would cost us all the most. So I think that's where I'd leave that.
Thank you. Admiral Munsch.
Yeah, so on the regain the initiative, quite clearly, that's what needs to be done. I think you'll probably see a lot of themes like that coming out of DoD here related to that. On the partnership with allies, I think, guess because it's football season here, American football, that got that on my mind. But kind of like the Navy football team, right? You know, I opened up with massed technology, let's say quality and proficiency. It's like the Navy football team, right? It's never going to have more mass than the other team. If you do a player-by-player comparison, the Navy team's always going to be on the weaker side. But where they hold up is in that proficiency, the discipline, and most importantly here in this context, the teamwork that goes with it. And so I think that will become ever more important going forward. And it's not just teamwork for the sake of teamwork, but there's a diversity of capabilities that come with that, and also a diversity of authorities. And I think the adversary knows pretty well how we restrain ourselves in certain areas based on authorities. But when faced with a diversity there, that can make it far more complex for them.
Thank you both. I'm going to turn to a couple questions from our audience today. This question from JC Lead, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Vladimir Putin has famously stated that the nation that leads in AI will dominate the world. And China has declared their intent to be the world leader in AI by 2030. How do the speakers look at AI and associated autonomous capabilities as part of strategic advantage? Air Marshal Gale.
Thanks. It's a great question, and I don't know. I'm not sure I necessarily completely agree. I see where the point comes from, but you know, AI is a pretty broad topic, and in terms of artificial general intelligence, I absolutely see that in today's world, if we were able to introduce artificial general intelligence, you would have a definitional advantage. But we are some way from that. And as we get towards that, we've got things to sort out. The first thing is understanding data, making sure our data standards, all the boring stuff means that our data feeds our machine learning algorithms that allow us to use AI for some of the more boring tasks that don't make the headlines and don't make the good magazines, but they're nevertheless very, very important. And there's something about, in terms of investment, I talked about quantum earlier. China, for example, invests roughly half the world investment in quantum. You've got to pay attention to that. AI, though, is on the way to AGI. It's quite hard to keep that genie in the bottle. And how much better is your AI than my AI? And actually, where do my ethics, where do my tactics, techniques, procedures allow me to use it for the greatest effect, is in some ways more interesting than simply controlling the code, which I think is one of the less interesting parts of it.
Excellent, excellent. Vice Admiral Munsch, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it will be a critical ingredient going forward, but it's not the only ingredient. Where it helps contribute to decision advantage, like sorting out masses of data for you to find the needle in the haystack, so to speak, or enable a speed of decision, all that adds to the overall advantage, but I don't know that it takes away everything else. But this is one of those where it's a future technology. Probably be better to be leading that than following that. So, if that's the sense of the question, yeah, I think we should try to be at the forefront of it. But we can't act like that's the panacea for all things. It really takes the whole system that we would develop.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Mark Jameson. In 2015, the Chinese created a theater-level command known as the Network System Department, with responsibility for information operations and, crucially, the authority to target not just our military, but also other components of strategic strength across what we know as the DIME. My question is in two parts. Part one, do you intend to make the necessary organizational change to match our adversaries? And two, with organizational changes, what challenges do you foresee with gaining authority to operate across the spectrum? Vice Admiral Munsch.
Well, that kind of change would be driven at a much higher level that would require a debate between the leaders of the executive and legislative branches. So I don't see that happening real soon. I think for better or for worse, the pattern in the U.S. is that we have to have experienced some kind of crisis to drive a change of that order. But it does highlight the point that there are many asymmetries between us and China. And in our case, there's a pretty sharp dividing line between Department of Homeland Security and Department of Defense in some of these things. And whereas, at least the way the question was described, there's been a unification of that on the Chinese side.
And I'd agree, absolutely a policy decision to go for those things. But I would also say that we are starting to bring together and blur some of those lines between government departments. That's part of our response to the integrated review, the integrated operating concept. So we're certainly getting after that. And just because we're not going to do a thing currently doesn't mean we shouldn't think about it. So I do believe we should be asking questions about use of certain weapons. We should be looking to our own history, where actually the UK has got a rich and not always proud history of using privateers to fight our wars for us. And an interesting hypothetical question for me is, what if you just paid the Wagner Group more? That'd be interesting, wouldn't it? So I think we should be asking these questions, exploring them. But exactly as Stuart says, that's a matter of policy, and it's probably not for us.
Thank you. We have a question from Commander Hooper. And this one, I believe, goes to you, Air Marshal Gale, but we could probably turn the tables a bit for Admiral Munsch. And And what does the UK hope to see in the emerging US national security strategy and national defense strategy that will follow that vis-a-vis strengthening alliances and partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. It really is. So I think we need to have discussions about complex factors, and I'm talking about, you know, when you have a fight in one part of the world, what that triggers in another part of the world, because I really don't believe it will be as unitary as we've seen in the past. So I think that will be a layer down that we'll need to resolve. But in order to resolve that, we will need sufficient cover, I think, in the top level documents to talk about how we integrate and the ways into particularly above secret networks at speed. Because I would hate to feel that we had a relationship that was artificially slowed by some of the things that have slowed us in the past when the battle is getting ever faster. So looking at those actually quite difficult things, some are in policy, some are in law in the US, around no forewarn about sharing access to networks. And of course, that means sharing vulnerabilities, because everywhere's a node, right? Everywhere's a way in. So you've got to be doing that trustfully and having the way to integrate security classifications up and down. That will sound like quite a tactical answer to quite a big question, but I think it's at the heart of what can make the big things pay off.
Thank you. Admiral Munsch, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, but we can pass as well.
No, I don't think our most senior military leaders are always best of chums, even back in World War II. But they found a way to work together that was effective. I think that those sorts of relationships are critical, and we ought to put a lot of focus on that. Certainly on the information sharing as well on another level, and then I think all the way down to the lowest levels, interchangeability should be a goal for us to work on, so that we aren't simply deconflicted or integrated in what we do, but we're truly interchangeable.
Thank you. Air Marshal Gale, in your opening, you mentioned net assessment, which is a wonderful methodology and approach to analyzing comparative advantage, us versus them, in particular balance problems. And I wanted to ask a question: if we consider net assessment with the Chinese in this example, we could focus on a military context or on a broader national security context. But what are the balance areas that you feel are the things that should be keeping us up at night, and the areas where we must or either sustain or go out and get strategic advantage?
Todd, thanks. Well, look, I'm unfortunately this question. I'm just racking my brains for what would be appropriate to say here, and I'm struggling somewhat. But I'm going back to alliances and partnerships, because when we see the other side, we see a very transactional nature of getting people within the fold, an unashamedly dependency creating relationship clients, but we don't see very many friends, and so I think concentrating on that's going to be pretty important. But I think I'll probably have to leave it at that.
Understood. Admiral Munsch, any thoughts? And I understand we don't want to get into anything that would advantage our adversaries on this call.
Yeah, I think another one to point out would be geography, and to a degree, that can shift in terms of the net assessment as to whose advantage it is favoring, and we ought to be sensitive to that and keep the advantage on our side.
Fantastic. I have a question here from Nick Wright, and this question gets to the difficulty of imagining what a great power war would look like today, and we have lots of precedent, and they are long, grinding. We go into them thinking, hey, this will be over by Christmas. But in point of fact, history teaches that these are very long, protracted conflicts. In the case of World War II, it lasted 2,139 days for Britain. So if a limited US-China conflict broke out, then the years-long war is not unlikely, even in our nuclear age. How can the UK and US best prepare for long Great War? Admiral Munsch, you want to kick that one?
Yeah, I think I'd start with resilience. And that's really from the top on down. And that includes preparing the country for what that war might look like, because the morale and the public support would be so critical in that kind of contest. And I think we have a great example in what Britain did in World War II as to what that would take and what resilience looks like.
Air Marshal Gale.
I think that's a great theme. But let me say, Todd, all wars have ended by Christmas, right? That's true. I think resilience is really important. I'd say from my perspective, we had a high COVID death rate. One of the highest. In fact, I think Russia beat us in the European area. That was it. And us Brits love talking about the Second World War, and goodness me, weren't there plenty of harks back to it in my country. So I think I don't think we should underestimate the strength of and the innate resilience of our populations. That I think we've had a window into that through COVID that we never expected. But look, right now, Russia is to an extent controlling the price of gas, as in not petroleum, gas that we burn for heating systems in the UK and across Europe. Well, our answer to that, a little bit like the US and shale gas, is we're becoming energy independent. We're looking at those things where we are weak and we're strengthening those things. But in terms of the answer to how do you prepare for the kind of conflict that you're talking about, I think you prepare for it by making it less likely to happen. Because once you're in something like that, all bets are off. And we've talked here about the what is often termed the Western way of warfare and all of the restraints and things we put on ourselves. You've only to look through history. That's a behavior of convenience. We all know that when our national survival is threatened, those behaviors change very, very rapidly. None of us wants to get anywhere near that. So just making it really clear and communicating what the costs of that are, I think is really important.
Oh, thank you both. In your remarks, we often hear a lot about whole of government and the need for whole of government to take this on, but even extending that to whole of nation. And you both have referenced this in some of your responses so far of mobilizing our nations to think about this, but I'm not sure we've been effective in this. Admiral Munsch, you mentioned communication, and certainly that in the bureaucratic sense and within the lifelines of the Pentagon and so forth is critical. But are we communicating effectively to our respective populations, our citizens, about the threat we face and what must be done to confront it? Are we sort of going it alone as a government and respectively our militaries within those governments? Admiral Munsch.
Of course, it's a mixed bag because it's an extremely difficult problem to get after. On the macro level, and I'm not assigning any value to any political things here, just to make sure everybody understands that. But the decision by the Trump administration to declare China a competitor, whereas that had not been done before, I think shifted quite a bit in the U.S. in terms of how China was perceived. In addition to a great deal of China's own behavior, which informed people could assess very much on their own. But mobilizing a nation for a conflict, it's been quite a while since that's been done to great effect. And in part, it's gotten ever harder because the means of communicating and the availability of information is so much more pervasive than it used to be. And so there was a time when you could have a near monopoly on information with, say, the president and a small number of news services and a few number of venues and where that was dispensed. So it takes a leader who can understand the current tool set and know how to mold the country. Oftentimes people talk about how President Kennedy was able to latch on television in a way that nobody had done before, and President Trump, with the use of Twitter, would be an example of that. But I think it's a combination of you have to have a vision that you have to be a good communicator, and you have to have the tools that make that effective. And that gets increasingly sophisticated as we go forward in time.
Air Marshal Gale, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is, it's remarkably hard to mobilise, especially over a thing that hasn't happened yet. But what has happened yet is happening now, probably right now, is cyber attack on our networks. It's happening to individual citizens. It's happening to the DoD, MOD. It's happening to our supply chains. So we're certainly, one of the branches we're using in the UK is to try and make people understand that they are under attack, that it's not necessarily a state-based, but it's quite possibly state-sheltered, tolerated, or otherwise supported, and that this threat is in their pockets and on their doorsteps right now. So if we can make our entire nation mobilise more resilient in a cyber way, then I think perhaps that's a smaller step, should we need it, into something else.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question and maybe just a quick wrap up from both of you. And this question has to do with really, I think, armed conflict below, or competition below the level of armed conflict. And how are the U.S., this is from Anonymous, how are the U.S. and the UK building their forces to compete in the information environment? This is, after all, the information age. What are the immediate steps we should be taking to compete and achieve a comparative advantage? Admiral Munsch.
Yeah, I think one thing that we have is that we don't have a 24/7 mechanism at getting at competition, and it's a 24/7 game. And we have a decision process emanating out of the National Security Council with actions that go to individual departments, but the NSC is not big enough to integrate all the activities, to act as a clearinghouse for everything that goes on. Nor is it, as hard as they work over there, they only work probably 19/7 as opposed to 24/7. So there's not something that goes around the clock. And I think there's maybe another layer beneath the NSC that we might be missing here, that focuses on integration and continuous monitoring and activity, and understanding all the interrelationships of what's going on with the whole of government effort.
Thank you. Air Marshal Gale.
I think we're doing a lot of mechanical stuff. So employing coders, saying to people, you need 2 superpowers. I joined the Air Force as a pilot, and that was enough. Now I need to be a pilot and something else, which will be generally data, cyber related. We formed a number of brigades. I think everybody's doing that around getting at this sort of thing. But I think the biggest single thing we might want to consider is empowerment. So we suffer the same issues where centrally we can't respond. And I get it. If somebody attacks your base, you probably want to have, beyond immediate self-defense, you want to have a strategic response there. But in the information war, it's immediate. There's a timely nature about this that isn't, it's no good being right 24 hours late. So empowering and allowing our people at the very edge of our units to take that on themselves is both terrifying and essential. So for me, that will make a big change to us.
Amen. Well, we're at the top of the hour, and I'd like to give just closing remarks. Any last minute thoughts, starting with Admiral Munsch and then closing with you, Air Marshal Gale.
For Todd and the listeners, appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all. I hope that one of the subliminal messages in all this is the tightness of the alliance between the UK and the US. Again, thank you.
And I'll echo that. Our relationship is remarkably strong, and that's why it's very easy to do things like this and all of the other things we do together. This is a really big topic. I'm really glad you brought it up. It's been fantastic to have the opportunity to talk about it for an hour, and let's do lots more of it. Thank you.
Well, my thanks to both of you, and thanks to everyone that works behind the scenes to pull these together, my team and the team over in the UK. Thank you both for your investment of time. I know how incredibly busy and compressed your schedules are. Very enlightening, and I look forward to future ones. Thank you both.